the Carter administration had some hope of establishing tolerable relations with the new Iranian regime, especially since that regime was deeply hostile to the atheistic Soviet Union. Although most of the U.S. embassy staff in Tehran and all of their dependents had been withdrawn, a skeleton staff of a little under 100 remained in the embassy compound. Indeed, it briefly appeared possible that the U.S. government might gain influence with some of Iran's new leaders. I mentioned earlier that in the earlier months of the revolution, Khomeini had been obliged to share power with more moderate Iranians. One of those relative moderates was a French-educated economist named Abul Hassan Bani Sadr. A longtime opponent of the Shah, Bani Sadr had gotten to know Khomeini in Paris, and following the triumph of the revolution, had returned to Iran to serve as a minister in the new Iranian government. Bani Sadr did not share Khomeini's ideology, but he forged an alliance of convenience with him in order to have a role in shaping Iranian politics. Sensing an opportunity to gain influence with the new revolutionary government, the CIA, which continued to function from the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, established contact with Bani Sadr. A CIA agent named Vernon Casson, who went by the alias Guy Rutherford, began meeting regularly with Bani Sadr. Casson did not tell Bani Sadr that he was working for the CIA. He pretended to be an American businessman who was interested in investing in Iran and who had important political contacts in Washington. The short-term objective of these meetings was to acquire information about the new Iranian government's attitudes and plans. The long-term objective was to maintain friendly relations with an important official who might someday supplant Khomeini as the leader of Iran. Apparently, Bani Sadr did not realize he was being cultivated by the CIA, but he seemed eager to maintain contact with Casson, who, as I said, was posing as a businessman, and this gave the CIA hope that it had a potential ally in the Iranian government. Indeed, the Carter administration became so confident of its ability to gain influence with the new government that it began building up the embassy staff again in Tehran. But then, in the fall of 1979, Carter made a major blunder. By now, it had become known that the Shah, who was still in Mexico, was seriously ill with cancer and needed advanced medical treatment. Under pressure from Brzezinski, who insisted that the United States could not abandon a former ally, Carter agreed to allow the Shah to enter the United States to get treatment. This gesture enraged and alarmed Khomeini's student supporters. They suspected the story about the Shah's illness was a sham, concocted to get the Shah into the United States so that he could sit down with the U.S. government and plot his own return to Iran. The collective memory of the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh 25 years earlier played an important role in the Iranian students' perceptions. You will recall that in 1953, in the midst of the U.S.-sponsored effort to overthrow Mossadegh, the Shah had lost his nerve and fled the country for Rome, only to return in triumph after the coup had succeeded. The Iranian students believed that history was repeating itself, that the Shah once again was biding his time abroad, waiting for the CIA to prepare the way for his return. As I mentioned, by this time, the Carter administration was rebuilding the staff of its embassy in Tehran, which only intensified the students' suspicions. Convinced that the CIA was using the U.S. Embassy as a headquarters for plotting the overthrow of the revolutionary government, the students decided to take over the embassy and prevent it from being employed for this nefarious purpose. So, on November 4th, 1979, a huge crowd of Iranian students surrounded the embassy compound. Soon, students began climbing over the compound gate, overwhelming the Marine Guards, who chose not to fire their guns. The students occupied the embassy compound and took 76 embassy employees captive. Now, initially, just about everyone, including the students themselves, assumed that the embassy seizure would end quickly. The expectation was that the students would parade the hostages around for a while, make some fiery anti-American speeches, but then the Iranian government, the grown-ups, would step in and say, okay, boys, you've made your point, now it's time to let the Americans go. And the students would let them go. But the Iranian government never intervened in this way. What happened instead was that the Ayatollah Khomeini, sensing an excellent opportunity to consolidate his power within Iran, publicly endorsed the seizure of the embassy. And once Khomeini had given his blessing, it became impossible for anyone else in the Iranian government to publicly consider releasing the hostages. So the students continued to hold the hostages, now under the auspices of the Iranian government. It was the start of what was to be a 444-day ordeal for the hostages, for the American people, and for President Carter. Once they had gotten control of the U.S. Embassy, the students began ransacking the compound, searching for evidence that the embassy had indeed been used as a headquarters for an effort to destroy the revolution and restore the Shah. And it was not long before the students hit pay dirt. At the start of the embassy takeover, embassy employees had begun frantically shredding sensitive documents. After they burst into the embassy, the students took possession of the shredded documents. They brought in women who were expert carpet weavers and put them to work painstakingly restitching the documents into readable form. It was by restoring these documents that the students first learned of Vernon Cassin's contacts with Beni Sadr. One of the restored documents, which the students published shortly thereafter, is a report from the CIA station to the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. It describes Cassin's, aka Rutherford's, meetings with Beni Sadr, who is given the code name SD Lure 1. And it remarks that efforts should continue to obtain his cooperation. An individual with the access he enjoys should be able to furnish info of value in the period ahead. The document also describes Beni Sadr's potential as a long-term asset for the United States. Cassin describes Beni Sadr as having a promising political future. Ambitious and politically astute, he appears to be playing his game cautiously with an eye to the day when Khomeini passes from the scene. Being a longtime plotter, he could see his way in the future to plot against the regime, if either he feels it is drifting away from its revolutionary objectives or that it would be in his interests to do so. This faulty parallelism there, but you get the point. By the time this document was made public in 1980, Beni Sadr had become president of Iran. Even though Beni Sadr probably hadn't known he was hanging out with the CIA, the revelation deeply damaged his credibility, and he was soon forced to resign. Beni Sadr's departure was a further sign that moderates had lost influence within the Iranian government and that radicals were securely in charge. The disturbances in Iran caused a disruption of oil shipments from Iran to the West, leading in turn to a 60% hike in oil prices and a steep rise in inflation. In 1975, the inflation rate in the United States had been 7%. In 1980, it was 13%. As had happened after the Yom Kippur War, there were long lines at gas stations. Although these problems could not be blamed on the Soviet Union, they led to an increased sense of vulnerability in the West and to a fear that the Soviet Union might somehow take advantage of the West's distress. And such concerns seemed to be vindicated in December 1979, just a month after the U.S. hostages were taken, when 80,000 Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan, quite out of the blue as far as most Americans were concerned. I'll have more to say about Afghanistan in a later lecture. For now, suffice it to say that Moscow's audacious move, coming in the midst of the Iranian crisis, only deepened the sense of crisis then enveloping the United States and indeed much of the rest of the world. Events in Afghanistan also reinforced the widespread impression that Carter was weak and ineffectual, incapable of standing up to America's foes. In early 1980, Carter passed word to the Shah, who was now dying of cancer, that he was no longer welcome in the United States. So the Shah left the country, ultimately settling in Egypt. By this time, American society was totally obsessed with the hostage crisis. Network news programs began their broadcasts by emblazoning on the screen, Day 32, or whatever day it was, in the captivity of the American hostages in Iran. They did this